I have to get all equipped up here. Okay, so I'm Lisie Kitchel. I work with the DNR and the Bureau of Endangered Resources. I'm going to be talking today about endangered resources. There were a stack of these sheets put at the corner of each table. Take one and pass it along. If you did that already, that's great. If you didn't do so, there are also a whole bunch more on the back table. So if you want to take a bunch back, if you're working for, say, a company that you want to provide them to all the staff, feel free to take a bunch back there. They're for that purpose. The other thing is, if you can't hear me, wave your hand and I'll talk louder. I can talk really loud, but hopefully you can all hear me. And the other thing is, this is informal, so feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time. It's not, sometimes it's easier to do it when it's in the context. So, first I want to just impress upon why we protect endangered resources. We're managing for conservation and biodiversity, we're protecting species and communities, and we're managing, hopefully, against habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and environmental pollution. So that's why we're out there protecting these resources so they can be maintained for the future. Our Endangered Species Law are under statutes and codes. This is what authorizes us to list things as endangered and also to protect them. So, state endangered species differ between plants and animals. State listed endangered and threatened species and endangered animals are protected on all lands, all public and private lands. So any listed animal is protected anywhere it occurs, anyway, anywhere, anyhow. The plants, however, are only protected on public lands. So that protects private landowners with regard to endangered plants on their private lands. And in addition to that, there are exceptions for plants for agriculture, for forestry, and for utility activities. We also try to protect special concern species. These are species which are not legally listed, they're not legally protected. However, there's a reason to believe that they may soon become endangered, so we try to protect them if at all possible. Often these species co-occur with already listed species, so it's no big deal to protect the special concern species along with a listed species because they often are in proximity to each other. But we do try to protect them. That's voluntary. We have a lot of organizations and state agencies that go ahead and protect them. Our forestry practices actually require the protection of those species. So, so that's just something to be aware of. And the other thing is that sometimes these state special concern species are protected by other factors. So we might list it as a state special concern species, however, it may be federally protected. Karner Blue butterfly is one of those. It's a federally listed species. However, within the state, it's only special concern because we happen to have the global population of Karner Blues in the world. There's a few smatterings of them in other parts of other states. But they're so abundant in parts of Wisconsin that we don't list them as endangered. However, the feds do because on a federal scale, this is a very, very rare butterfly. We're just lucky enough to have them all. They're also, some of those same special concern species are protected by Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So it might be especially in the sand frac area, it would be your grassland birds and things like that. So they're protected during the nesting season. And then there are other regulations like the HERP regulations that are prohibitive animal species. So those are things for protection of snakes or turtles above, so that they're not over collected and just harmed in other ways. We also try to protect natural communities that are outstanding examples. This might be fens, bogs, prairies, where it's an incredibly rich, unique natural piece. It's an example of what was more widespread, or as an example with high biodiversity, so that we try to protect those natural communities. They are not legally protected unless there are listed things there. However, we do try to protect them whenever possible. And then we protect other things as well, bat or snake hibernaculums, so bat caves, snake hibernaculums, which tend to be where there's a big mound of rocks and the likes, if it's a known. Bird rookeries, things like egrets are actually protected species within Wisconsin, but there's also rookeries that are out there that we try to protect. and then what is considered migratory bird concentration sites, and those are areas that are used during the flyovers. So when the birds are coming from South America, they're going to Canada, as they're coming through, they use these areas for resting areas, feeding areas. They're essential for them to be able to complete those migrations. And again, those are protected if they contain listed species. They are not protected otherwise, but we do try to encourage their protection whenever possible. So federally endangered species have similar rules and slightly different rules. Their rules for endangered animals are basically the same as ours for all public and private lands. So animals are protected no matter where they occur. And as with plants, the plants are only protected, in this case, only on federal lands and on projects with federal funding. So a lot of the sand mining is not going to involve federal funding unless you got some TIF money in there or some other kinds of things. Other projects, other development projects and other things like that do involve federal funding, and if there is federal funding involved, then that's would protect those plants. If you've got, say, a railroad spur that's getting redeveloped to give you access to a site, and maybe that involves federal highway monies or federal funds, so that if there's plants along those corridors, they might be. If there's road projects, it often involves, even if it's a local road, it may get their funding from DOT, which may get their funding from federal highways. So there may be federal highway money involved in that, and therefore those plants would be protected along those road corridors. There are some exemptions from the federal law for non-essential populations, such as the whooping cranes, which we have now in Wisconsin, and they finally have started to nest on their own, but those populations are not protected at this point in time. They're considered experimental, and they are not protected. And then for species that, the candidate species are exempt, so if the feds say, hey, we think this is a species that we might list, then those are considered candidate species. Those species are not protected until they are officially proposed. So they go through a whole process where they take the candidate species, they do all these status assessments, then they get it to the proposed stage. At the proposed stage, it is protected because at that point in time, they think they're going to be listing it, and it just takes a long time to get that listing process through. But if they're just candidate species, they're not protected. However, many of our candidate species are state listed. And the reason for that is that we've already identified that they're very rare. That's why we're asking the feds to list them. So if there are state listed species, then they're protected by state law. So be it federal or state law, you have to follow the threatened and endangered species laws regardless of the source of that information. So there are also other state and federal laws that protect endangered species. As I mentioned earlier, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Again, in the sand mining area, a lot of that would probably be grassland birds. For things like bridges, there's the swallows that nest on the bridges, and you're not allowed to affect them during the nesting season. So that's one of the primary things for the Migratory Bird Act. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Even though the bald eagle was delisted by the feds, it was an earlier act prior to the Endangered Species Law called the Bald and Golden Eagle Act that protected those species. And that has provisions for protection in it already. There is a website, I don't have it listed here unfortunately, I can provide it to you if you're interested. Or you can just go Google in and do Bald and Golden Eagle Act and you'll get it. And that's where the feds have gone through and they have actually looked at the regulations in that act and what you have to do. And for most part it says you have to stay a certain distance away from the eagle nest, or you can, time of year restrictions. So those are things that protect things other than our state listed laws. And then the DNR permit requirements. So anything that a DNR staff conducts, funds, or approves must consider impacts to endangered resources. So a lot of times your permits, when you get a permit, will have provisions in there for there being endangered species that occur on that land. So you may have to put up certain kind of fencing, or you may have to do, or it may just say you have to contact our bureau to get that information as to guidance on how to avoid impacts to these endangered species. So the endangered resource screening process. So if a project comes to us, we actually review that. We have a database that takes into consideration what is known, known records for rare species throughout the state. And we also look at other sources of information. Have there been recent breeding bird surveys in that area? Have there been recent other kinds of surveys that have turned in that information, fisheries, those kinds of things. We check if your project is adjacent to wetlands and water bodies. We check those areas for potential species. You may not have a record right at that site, but if it's in a water body that extends and there's a potential for those species to occur in that whole aquatic corridor, then we look and say, is this species, could this occur on your site or adjacent to your site? We consider landscape and contiguous habitat. So if you've got a woodlot there that continues with a woodlot where we have known nesting birds, then we would look and see, is there the potential for those birds to nest on your land, because it's really one contiguous habitat. And that happens too with some of the prairies. If there's a contiguous prairie that extends into that private property, a lot of the sand mines are on private properties, and many of them are old agricultural lands. So the agricultural land is usually not an issue, although grassland birds can occur in pasture areas. But it could be that you've got stands that within that of woodlots and things like that, where some of the eagles or hawks or some of these other species could occur. So that's why we look at that contiguous kind of landscape and say, could these species occur here as well? And then we determine the potential for the species to occur and figure out what can be done about that, which is we determine if there's potential impacts. And the first question we always ask, and my mantra is avoid, 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 avoid. It makes things a whole lot easier for everybody. So can those impacts be avoided? If you've got, say, a small sand prairie on the corner of a project area, and if you can just not take out that less than acre prairie, it makes it a whole lot easier for everybody. And then you also don't have to do any restoration after the fact too. And can the project be modified, which is still that same kind of avoidance stuff. Sometimes there's a road planned right through, and it's just that it's the shortest point between that, say, that existing railroad spur, and that's right where those endangered prairie plants are, and that railroad spur needs to protect those plants. So you simply move that road slightly a distance over, that kind of things. So often the projects easily can be modified to avoid impacts, and we've had very few projects that those have been significant things to try and modify the project to avoid impacts. And then if that can't be done, can those impacts be mitigated? Sometimes we'll have, for example, prairies where we have the plants that are required for the listed butterflies and moths, but we may not have records for those moths there, or we may. And what we ask then is, after that project goes through, that sand has been removed during the restoration efforts, to put back seed, specific seeds. So put back phlox moth seed for the phlox moth and things like that. So we ask that that restoration be done in a manner that restores that habitat back to what it was before this project came through. And so that's the mitigation that is required. I think Anna will be talking about Karner Blues, and there's a lot of mitigation associated with the Karner Blue butterfly. Okay, so ways to avoid. Time of year restrictions are an easy way to avoid. You don't do the work during when those grassland birds are out there. You wait till they're done nesting. That way you're not in violation of either state or federal Endangered Species Law or the Migratory Bird Act. After they're no longer nesting, you can go in then and change that habitat, because they're not present. You're not going to destroy those birds for that time period. So you just have to wait till they're not there. For eagle nests, you can't do the work right where the eagle nest is during that time of year, but you can do it at other times of the year. So one of the easiest things is time of year avoidance. For some of the species, for if it's private plants or if it's things like butterflies and moths, they're there year round. The adults are there, or their larvae are there, or their eggs are there. So there are some species you can't avoid through time of year. Some of the herp species you can easily avoid through time of year because they're only active at certain times of year. So we put restrictions on that based on when they would be out and about. But once they are no longer in the project area, Unfortunately, state law does not protect habitat, so that you can then go in, you can go ahead and mine after they're no longer either reproducing or laying their eggs or doing that thing on the land. And you can do that outside of that time of year restriction. Another very easy one is to keep them out of your project area. This works, this kind of fencing works really well for turtles. So if you're adjacent to a water body that has listed turtles in it, we often ask you to put up you need silt fence anyway, but this has to be up usually earlier than you might be working or something to keep those turtles out. And the reason is you start opening up a sand mine and the turtles think it's nirvana. They're like, wow, who made all this nesting habitat? And they're very attracted to that open sand for laying their eggs in. If they get in there, they lay their eggs, and you're on a hold until those eggs hatch and get out of there. So you're better off keeping those turtles out. And what needs to happen, though, is that this fence can't be just kind of slapdash put in. It needs to be properly trenched, because these are turtles and they dig. So you properly trenched, properly maintained so they can't climb over. Wood turtles are really good climbers. They can actually climb out of like dog kennels. So it needs to be properly maintained. You can't have areas that they can easily get over if you want to keep them out. And then that's something that just needs to be this year normally, well, last year we were telling people they had to have the fences in by May 1st and then calling them ahead and saying, hey, can you get that fencing in sooner because things were happening last year. This year we're at the exact opposite. This year the turtles are still hanging in the ground because it's still snowing up north. So the fencing deadline can vary by season. You're better off the earlier you get it in, then you don't have to worry about them being active and getting into your site. So, and silt fence is required for basic water quality control measures anyway, so it's not something that's unusual to expect in a project area. One other one that I mentioned earlier was for bald eagle nests, avoiding, and this is also true for red-shouldered hawks, that you avoid the nest area. So these zones, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, have different activities allowed in those zones. Beyond zone 3, pretty much you can do what you want. That doesn't seem to bother the birds. And then they have certain activities you can be allowed within those. So it's a matter of just knowing where that nest is, keeping that work outside of that area. And it's, again, for the bald eagle nest, that's written up, and for the red-shouldered hawk, we have guidance on our website. So check those websites out, and I'll give you those at the end. And what I was saying is check for available avoidance guidance. Our endangered resource website has fact sheets on species, management kind of stuff, so that would give you, like for the red-shouldered hawks, that would give you the zones that you needed to stay away from. The turtle avoidance minimization guidance I mentioned is predominantly just the fencing, keeping them out of your project area. There's another one called the Grassland Savanna Protocol, which is really relevant to the sand mining areas. What we found was that we couldn't just say, oh, you can't affect any of the grasslands, because if you don't do things to periodically disturb that kind of habitat, it will grade from grassland to trees, and you no longer will have that kind of prairie savanna habitat that you need to. So it needs periodic disturbance, and primarily that's accomplished through burning, but it also can be accomplished through mowing and brushing and some of those other activities. What we did was we, as a state, got together with all the experts of all the different groups that would be affected by those kinds of activities in those prairie, grassland, savanna habitats, and said, what can we do to minimize this kind of take of these species while still allowing activities to proceed forward that are going to maintain that kind of habitat. And so they said, okay, you can only burn or disturb, say, half of this area at a time. And then if you do that every other year, then you're allowing an area that animals can move back and forth. And it's a very prescriptive kind of thing. It says if you do this activity, you do this. If you do it this time of year, those kinds of things. And it's available on our endangered resource website. And then there's the Karner Blue guidance, which I'm not going to talk about because I think Anna's going to talk about. But avoidance is, as I said, is the easiest way to do it. Then you don't have to deal with having to come back and do something else to mitigate. However, if the project can't be modified, if the impacts can't be minimized, again, we ask, okay, do you really have to have it this road this wide? Can you have it less than that? Can you put that building over here as opposed to over there? If that's not possible, then we have what's called an incidental take process, which you then apply for. You say, this is what I'm going to do, where I'm going to do it, what I'm going to impact. And that incidental take, you can then get a permit that will authorize you to go ahead and proceed. And we know there's going to be impacts to the species, but we've evaluated it. Primarily, we've evaluated it with the big question is, will the impacts from that project jeopardize the recovery, existence and recovery of the species in the state? We have to answer that question. And heretofore, I only know of one project that was not allowed to proceed forward, and that was because there was only one population of the species. And we said, you know, don't even ask. It's the only population. There's, you know, what can we do? Of course that would jeopardize it. But the rest of them, usually the species are widespread enough that you can get an incidental take authorization or permit to cover those kinds of activities. As again, I'd say 95% of the projects come through and are able to avoid. So it's not like we have to go through that incidental take permit process very often, because it's usually very avoidable, the kinds of impacts. So how do you get this endangered resource information? You submit an endangered resource review request form, and here's the link, but however, those links are available on this sheet, so you don't have to sit and scramble that link down. You submit this form, it tells us what you're gonna do, where you're gonna do it, when you're gonna do it, that kind of stuff. And then we look that up, and that's where we do our search and do those other things. You can also go to the Endangered Resources website. It's just the DNR website. You go to Endangered Resources to review. So in case you lose your sheet or you don't know where to look, it's an easy lookup. And then you fill that information out. You request that from us. You can request that independently. It's also done, an endangered resource lookup would be done through any other permits that you request for the project area. However, if you have that done ahead of time, it facilitates the processing of that permit, because then they don't have to take time to do that. They don't have to, if they get hits, they don't have to call Endangered Resources and say, what do we do? We've worked that all out. When you get a letter back that tells you what you've got and where and what you need to do. So it saves you time if you do it ahead of that permit process. However, they will check to make sure that there are endangered species, and very, very extremely rarely will there be something different from the time you get that letter and that they check their permit. I mean, usually there's an additional information available. So that information, as I said, the links are available on this sheet, and if you lose it, it's a pretty easy lookup. And I guess this is just a reminder that if you, the sooner you get that endangered resource information, so if you know you're going to be doing something, request that information right away. The sooner you get it, the sooner you can plan for it. Because sometimes we say, well, there's probably going to be Karner there, and you're going to have to do surveys. And those surveys can only be done in certain windows of the year. And because of that, then you're going to have to wait, you know, half a year or even a year to get that window again, especially if you submit your request in, say, the end of July. You're going to have to wait a year to get back and be able to get out and do those surveys. So the sooner you can do it, the sooner you can have the information you need to be able to continue with your project. That helps you plan for avoidance. It helps you plan, as I said, for surveys, and it also facilitates getting either state and federal permits. And with that, I didn't see anybody waving their hands for questions during the thing, so I just kept talking. Are there any questions? Wow, none. That's good. Yes?
You said during the initial screening they review different databases to determine if there are any endangered resources. Are those databases available to the public?
One of the things that I didn't explain with the state endangered species law, they are that information is available to the public in a generalized format. So you can go to our website and you can look up your township range, and you can get a list of species known to occur in that township range. However, it does not give out specific locational information for where those species were recorded from. And the reason for that is our endangered species law is exempt from open records. And the reason for that is confidentiality of the data, And that's driven from protection of the resources. So if sometimes it's been known that if a species is known from a site, it either gets, if it's an orchid, it might get dug up and taken away. The turtles are notoriously collected and sold overseas in the herp trade. Snakes also are collected. There are a number of species, we've had species harassed because they wanted them to leave the area, you know, when they knew the exact location. A lot of times people already know where stuff is. So for protecting the species, we're exempt from open records, therefore we cannot provide publicly where they are. It kind of is a, it's just the way it is. So you can get that generalized. You can get up to township range, actually. If you go to our website, you click on the county, you click on the township range, and you get a list of species known to occur there. If you know, and then you can look at those species, you can go back to our website and you can say what occurs in these kinds of habitats, and you can pretty much figure out what might occur there. Consultants do that a lot. When they're bidding a project, they go and say what species might be here so that they can get an idea of what they're going to have to deal with. So it's kind of publicly available, kind of not. Go ahead, there was a question back there.
It's my understanding that the list is going through revision.
Yeah.
There's species coming off, species coming on. What do you know of where this industry is operating? What are the potential impacts for either species coming off or new species coming on the list? And what are the ones that you may want to be aware of?
Right, good question. One of the biggies in this neck of the woods would be the Blandings turtle is coming off. That's one of the turtles that occurs in this area. However, the wood turtle is going to remain on, so that would still be something that you'd still have to deal with that in terms of water bodies. There are some grassland birds that are being added to the upland sandpiper and things like that, which occur, but again, they co-occur with already existing listed species. So I don't think that that's going to be a significant increase in, they're going to occur in the same kinds of habitats, the higher quality habitats. So I don't think that's going to be a significant addition to suddenly you've got something new on the landscape that you didn't have before. So I don't think it's going to be significant. We're not adding that many, and we're taking far more off than we're adding. But good question. Any others?
Any other questions for Lisie?
And again, I'm going to be here for the rest of the day. Feel free to ask me questions. And there's more of those sheets in the back. Feel free to take as many as you want. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I am here to talk about the Karner Blue butterfly, and I have worked with the Karner Blue butterfly since about 2002, but I am not Jenny Bardeen, who is actually the current functional head of the Habitat Conservation Plan. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I might not be able to answer them, but I have provided her contact information at the beginning and at the end of the presentation. So if you do have questions, I can forward them to her for you, or you can email or call her at your leisure. Now, the Karner Blue butterfly is, well, okay, I'll go over the outline. First of all, I'm going to talk about what the Karner Blue is and why it's important. It's important for several reasons. It's not just a pretty little butterfly that's federally endangered. Then I'll go over the Karner Blue range and habitat and why it's important to mining. What the HCP is, I'll explain the incidental take permits. I'll go over Karner Blue and wild blue lupine surveys and the process of applying for a permit, mitigation, as was mentioned earlier, and then the application for inclusion into the Habitat Conservation Program. Now, the Karner Blue is, as mentioned earlier, federally endangered, but we do happen to have a lot of them in Wisconsin because of the huge amount of sand deposits that we have across the state. And a lot of these sand deposits manage to remain open. One of the biggest problems with barrens and savannas and prairie ecosystems is forest succession. These ecosystems used to dominate the Great Lakes region from Minnesota to New Jersey, and most of this habitat, in fact 99% of it or more, has been diminished or completely destroyed due to habitat succession, fire suppression. This is somewhat debated, but a lot of people believe that woodland bison were extremely important in keeping grasses down, and grasses really compete with a lot of those barrens and savanna plants. And, but we do still happen to have a lot of this habitat in the state of Wisconsin. It's often referred to as an open forest complex. Its barrens and savannas are grassland ecosystems, but they still have a lot of trees. Those trees are generally scrub oak, pin oak, white black oak, and pine, which in Wisconsin is normally jack pine. So it's a broad range, it's a broad range of habitat. Barren savannas and dry prairies covers a lot of different things, but they basically all function the same way when it comes to the Karner Blue. Now this is a map of the Karner Blue Range across the Great Lakes area. As you can see, the majority of the remaining habitat, which is blue, is in Wisconsin, and it follows an area across the Wisconsin that's called, usually referred to as the tension zone. And this was the furthest advance of the last glacial period, which began to recede about 12,000 years ago. And when it began to recede, it dumped sand all across this middle region of Wisconsin, and that's where the barrens and savanna habitats are. There were sand deposits all the way across here, but the majority of them remain open in Wisconsin, and that's why the Karner Blue habitat overlaps almost perfectly with frac mine sands. So you're going to be running into Karner Blues a lot, especially in Wisconsin. This is an example of the Karner Blue life cycle, which will become important if you ever have to conduct a survey. The Karner Blue's host plant is called the wild blue lupine plant. This is actually a very common plant. It grows in ditches all the time. It's a disturbance-loving plant. The seeds are extremely resilient. They will lie dormant in the soil for decades at a time, and if you go through an area and take the trees out or you run it over with some heavy equipment, the lupine just starts growing. It loves disturbance. It requires scarification. And if the lupine is there, you have a very good chance of the Karner Blue being there. The Karner has 2 life cycles over the period of a summer. There are the eggs that winter over. Those hatch around May and June. It's going to be a little later this year because there's still snow on everybody's heads. Those butterflies lay their eggs, and in July and early August they hatch, and that begins the second flight. And I have it a little higher here because that flight is always bigger because there's less egg mortality. The lupine, interestingly enough, does not actually match up that well with the Karner Blue life cycle. That peaks blooming in about late June, and then it dies off. So the larvae, which eat the leaves, sometimes in the summer they don't actually have enough unsenesced or undried up leaves to eat, and that can greatly affect this peak population. But generally, this population is still the biggest. So if you want to conduct a very thorough survey, you should do it later in the summer during the second flight. So why are these habitats important? There's a lot of different reasons for it. The main reason is that it, as I said, used to dominate the landscape from Minnesota to New Jersey. These habitats were all over the place. Consequently, because 99% of these habitats have been destroyed, the populations that live in these areas are less than 1% of what they naturally would be. Also, because these are sandy soils, a slight drop in elevation normally gives you a marsh right next to a barrens habitat. Naturally occurring barrens habitat are almost always directly adjacent to some sort of a wetland. Because of that, there's a cycle of groundwater recharging and marsh filtration that happens a lot in these areas. So all of these sandy areas are very important to fresh groundwater. Everybody likes fresh drinking water. So the Karner Blue, the important take-home message is that the Karner Blue is not just a little blue butterfly. We get that a lot. It's just a butterfly. Who cares? Well, one, it is federally endangered, but also the habitat is a huge vehicle for habitat and water resources recovery in Wisconsin and across the Great Lakes. It's a great opportunity to restore habitat for a plethora of other endangered and threatened species, as well as saving water resources and wetland resources. And wetland regulations are a whole other ball of wax, but it is something to keep in mind. Because of that huge crescent that goes across Wisconsin, there are a lot of counties that are affected by the Karner Blue. And this is a list of the Karners that fall within what is called the high potential range. And I have a map at the end of the presentation if anybody would like to see it. I meant to move it up and then I kind of forgot. But you can find the high potential range at this website online. and it's interactive, so you can zoom in on different areas. And the high potential range highlights areas that are within a certain buffer zone, I believe it is 5 miles, of known Karner Blue sightings. So across that tension zone in Wisconsin, it's almost the entire central part of the tension zone, but there are outlying Karner populations that exist. And that's all public information. You can look that up. So what is the Karner Blue Habitat Conservation Plan? Now, I don't have this information on here, but the Karner Blue Habitat Conservation Program was the first statewide HCP plan that was written for a species across an entire state. Now, HCP plans existed before this, but this was the first statewide one. This was formed in, I believe, 1999, late 90s definitely. A few years after that, the federal Karner Recovery Program was formed, and then in 2007, the Wisconsin Karner Recovery Program was formed. But the HCP came first. This is a habitat conservation plan in general is a plan that accompanies an incidental take permit. And this permit allows land managers to conduct activities that may take, which is harassing, harming, or completely killing off a population of a federally endangered or threatened species. So take covers a lot of stuff. The Habitat Conservation Plan, of course, outlines a conservation program for avoiding, minimizing, mitigating, and monitoring take, all different forms of take. Oh, and for those of you who don't know, this is the plant wild blue lupine. You've probably seen it growing in ditches someplace. It grows all over the place. There are several different kinds of take which will come out when you conduct your surveys and when you have to apply for a permit. There is intentional non-permitted take, which is not allowed, and that covers everything from collecting specimens of Karner blues to, building a shed on Karner Blue property. Not allowed if you don't have a permit. Then there is temporary take, which is permitted, and that means that your damaged habitat will be restored within 5 years. And then, of course, permanent, which would include mining, which is permitted, but then the damaged habitat is completely non-restorable, and that's where the mitigation comes in. Now, prior to any management activities, or any activities in Karner Blue areas, within the high potential range, you have to conduct surveys. Now you start with the Lupine Survey because if you don't have the host plant, you aren't going to have the butterfly. But like I said, wild blue lupine grows everywhere. It grows all over the place. A survey is good for 5 years, but it has to be conducted within 5 years or less before the management occurs. It can only be conducted by certified surveyors. Now, certification programs, training programs are offered multiple times every summer, so it's not difficult to get a certification. You have to go to the training session, and it only takes a day, and then you get your certification in the mail. But they teach you all about Karner blues in more detail than what I just said, and you learn all about the different surveying methods, and then you are good for 5 years. So if you go through the training session, you only have to do it once every 5 years. There are two different kinds of surveys, the Lupine surveys and the Karner Blue surveys. Now, like I said, first you conduct the Lupine survey, because if you don't have the host plant, you don't have to worry about the Karners. This is called the Level 1 Presence and Absence Survey. It determines whether or not the habitat is even suitable. And these are generally conducted from April to May through July 31st, because after the end of July, the lupine has died back to the point where it's really, really difficult to even see it anymore. And so after that, those surveys are just inappropriate. You probably will miss the lupine even if it's there. If the lupine is present, Karners may also be present. After that, you have to conduct what's called a Level 2 survey. And this is also a presence and absence survey. However, if you have lupine, you have to go back 3 times in a row to make sure that Karners aren't present. And that would be 3 times between June, when the Karners hatch, and early August, when the second flight is dying off. So over that period of time, you have to go out 3 times to make sure that the Karners aren't there. And if you find them on your last survey, then there's a Karner population present. Now, there are several different kinds of HCP partners. There are the full HCP partners, and actually, excuse me, because I'm going to find my notes here. since I don't normally talk about HCP stuff. Karner Blue surveys. All right. Full HCP Partners includes utilities, county forests, private forests, et cetera. All of these are required to perform all forms of monitoring. So that includes the lupine monitoring and the Karner Blue monitoring. Limited partners include town and county highway departments, or partners who have limited activities such as mowing roadsides, which is actually good for the lupine. Only lupine surveys are required. This usually involves nothing more than driving along and marking the areas on a map with a highlighter. And then in this case, Karner Blue surveys are not required, but if you conduct them, just to cover your tail, you have to use the official survey forms and you have to submit everything to the DNR. And then there are the voluntary partners, and this includes the public, basically. The public is always welcome to become an agent or a partner of the HCP. If they are a partner of the HCP as a private citizen, they are allowed to be consultants in anticipating projects with the HCP, and they are given a voice. Now, mitigation. As I mentioned earlier, if you have Karners present there and you are doing permitted permanent take, which means you are completely destroying the habitat, you have to contribute to the Mitigation Fund. First, you have to go through all the surveys and permitting, and then after you get the permit to be a partner of the HCP and conduct your work under the Fish and Wildlife permit, which even allows you to be there in the first place, then you have to contribute money to the Mitigation Fund, which is a great opportunity. Right now, we are working with one mining company, Unimin Mining, and they conducted mining on about 10 acres of habitat. And the protocol here is that the ratio of replacing destroyed habitat has to be at least 3:1. So we are going to create 30 acres of lost habitat for the 10 acres that Unimin mined. And that's to ensure the likelihood of habitat success, the 3:1 ratio. And also the cost for mitigation tends to be about, I think, $6,000 to $7,000 an acre. So Unimin contributed $30,000 to the Mitigation Fund, and that's being spread across 3 different state properties right now. And that work will be conducted this summer. Unimin went through the permitting process last summer, and all of that habitat work is going to be conducted this summer. So actually, the turnover rate is pretty quick. So if you are going to be doing a permanent take, you must either replace the habitat, replace destroyed habitat. I don't know why I said or here. And you have to contribute to the Mitigation Fund. This is based on a predetermined mitigation cost schedule, which is what you work through with the HCP when you contact them. The money goes towards habitat restoration on state recovery properties, and there are designated state recovery properties, which is what is covered under the Karner Blue Recovery Program. And of course, this all requires consultation with the HCP coordinator and with Fish and Wildlife. Jenny is a really nice lady. She'll be able to answer all of your questions regarding that. So, application for inclusion into the HCP. This requires consultation with the HCP, who is right now Jenny Bardeen. This also requires the development of an SHCA, which is, and I forgot to mention this, a species and habitat conservation plan. So you look at the habitat that you're going to be working on, you decide where you will be able to restore new habitat, or we decide where you'll be able to restore new habitat, and then we develop a species and habitat conservation plan. The benefits of becoming a partner of the HCP are many. The last one is the most important. You will be included under the DNR incidental take permit for the Karner Blue. So if you become a partner of the HCP and you contribute to the Mitigation Fund, you can work in these areas where there is a federally endangered species, and that's not very common. You also have a voice in developing guidelines, protocols, and regulations for the HCP. So you have an opportunity to tweak HCP protocols and monitored field operations. You can do this by becoming part of the Implementation Oversight Committee. The Implementation Oversight Committee is formed of representatives from each member category. Currently, the member categories include corridors, highways, and forestry. I'm not entirely Yeah, I've noticed that. I'm not, did I hit it? I don't know. I don't think I touched it. Do I need to turn it on?
Hello? Want to use this?
Sure, I can do that. No, I have no idea. All right. The Implementation Oversight Committee is formed of representatives from each member category, which I was saying is corridors, highways, and forestry right now. I don't know why corridors and highways are in different categories, but corridors I know covers transmission lines and pipelines. Right now, there is no category for agriculture or for surface mining, and probably because right now we only have one mining partner, and that's Unimin. However, if more mining partners join, then you will also have a voice in the Implementation Oversight Committee. And that basically concludes my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. I will be here over lunch and for most of the rest of the afternoon. Otherwise, feel free to contact Jenny Bardeen, who is the acting head of the HCP, Robert Hess, who is the coordinator for the Karner Blue Recovery Program, and here also is my contact information if you'd like to contact me, and I will probably forward your questions to either of them.
Are there any questions?
You mentioned that the cost to mitigate, to improve some new habitat was like $6,000 to $7,000 an acre.
Yeah.
And then Unimin was a partner in this, and I take it that they destroyed about 10 acres of habitat,
Yeah.
existing acres.
Yeah.
And they were going to now create 30 acres.
Yep.
And you mentioned that they contributed $30,000. Was that just negotiated then, or?
I guess it was negotiated.
Okay.
Yeah, that was. I asked a bunch of these questions this morning before I left, and that was what I was told. So, yeah, that would have been negotiated based on the habitat that they were restoring, the location, the equipment that they knew they were going to need, that sort of thing. Yep. Yeah. Sorry, I can't answer that better. The math didn't make sense to me either.
Jenny or Robert could probably answer that question better.
They probably could, yeah.
Thanks, Anna.
You're welcome.
All right, again, let's give Anna